This is Duke University.
Well, thank you for having me. Really honored to be here. I'm really happy to be here. There was 2 inches of snow on the ground this morning when I left Washington, and I hear I've brought it my way. So I apologize for that in advance. But I am happy to be back. Thank you, Imam and Tepli, for bringing me 2 years ago, and thank you for having me here today. So some of what I'm going to talk about is not so changed since we talked a couple of years ago. We have updated numbers that are updated in their numbers, but I think the landscape has not significantly changed. We know a little bit more about it than we did a couple of years ago. So first, let me just a couple of housekeeping things. If anyone in here is tweeting, I don't know who is, but our Public Religion Research Institute is at Public Religion. If you want to sort of include that in the tweet, that'll kind of put it in our feed, which will get it around to some more eyeballs. So today I've entitled the talk, Between Principle and Practice, American Muslims in Context, and I'm going to try to sort of put attitudes about American Muslims in the context of attitudes about other minority groups and immigrants, and sort of talk about the interplay between these sets of attitudes. Just a quick sort of thing about context of our research. So our research is public opinion research that is national public opinion data. We do mostly telephone surveys. We do some online surveys, but it's all based on random probability samples in the U.S. So these are measures of what the American public thinks, and I've tried to break it out in various ways to look at certain subgroups here. Most of the data here is based on 3 substantive surveys that we've done over the last couple of years, beginning with sort of in the wake of the Peter King hearings in Congress, picking up around the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and then some other surveys in between to track some attitudes in between those times. And I think what we're really trying to get our heads around is how Americans think, sort of the general population in America thinks about American Muslims, and sort of what frames they bring to their kind of thoughts about American Muslims. How much do they know? How much do they interact with Muslims? All those kinds of questions we're trying to kind of get our heads around and to see what difference all of those things make. So the 2 themes here in the title, I think that I'm going to carry through the presentation, between principle and practice. And I went back and looked at the presentation and the talk I gave a couple of years ago before coming here, and but only did it after I'd prepared this one and realized that there's a very similar theme. When I came a couple of years ago, I think the talk was entitled something like Between Fear and Fairness. And so there I talked about this tension in the American public when they think about Muslims or Islam. On the one hand, have a strong commitment to fairness and don't want to stigmatize any one group or target any one group. That's a very strong American value. At the same time, holding some real fears and stereotypes about the American Muslim community. And those 2 things really in tension. And I think in much the same way, I'm going to actually begin with where are Americans on the idea of pluralism and religious liberty, and Americans are quite solidly for those principles, right? So that's a very embedded American value, and yet when we look at, there are real concerns in the American populace about public expressions of Islam, for example, some real discomfort about certain public expressions of Islam, where those principles sort of run up against, I think, some tensions in practice. So hopefully we'll get a good lay of the land, and I think can at least hopefully at the end of this see where the American public is on a number of issues at this intersection. So let me just start with the big principles. If we ask about religious liberty, tolerance, things like separation of church and state, Americans are actually quite strong on these issues. So over here on the on your left, America was founded on the idea of religious freedom for everyone, including religious groups that are unpopular. Nearly 9 in 10 Americans agree with that statement. We asked the second question about religious books. in the wake of this pastor in Florida that was, sort of making sort of a publicity stunt out of burning copies of the Quran, about what Americans thought about that. Americans are nearly unanimous in saying that all religious books should be treated with respect, even if we don't share the religious beliefs of those who use them. So very against that kind of thing. And if we ask even a very strong statement, like we must maintain a strict separation of church and state, 2/3 of Americans agree with that statement. So just at the level of principle and religious liberty and acceptance and respect for other religious traditions, there is a kind of strong, I think, bedrock that Americans have, at least at the level of principle. And now I want to sort of walk through, so where are Americans then in their attitudes about and concerns about Islam and about American Muslims? I guess the first thing to sort of say is that Americans don't really know a lot about Islam, and this is true, sort of even as far as we are after 9/11, when there's been, lots of footage, lots of sort of media coverage about the Muslim community. Still, we only have about 1 in 10 Americans saying they know a lot about the beliefs and practices of Muslims. 3 in 10 say they know nothing at all. Now, in survey data, when you get people saying nothing at all, I mean, people tend to not want to say that, right? They tend to say, I know a little. But so it's kind of remarkable to me to see sort of nearly 3 in 10 saying they just know nothing about the religious beliefs and practices of Muslims. So this is part of the context, that there's a real knowledge vacuum in the American public. This also fits with that picture. We had a battery of questions where we asked about the frequency of social interaction with different groups in the American context. So way over on your left over there are African Americans, with more than 8 in 10 Americans saying they have at least occasional interactions with African Americans. Very similar numbers among Hispanics. And then if you look way over here on the right, Muslims and Mormons. You see that nearly 7 in 10 Americans say they have seldom or never have contact with someone who is Muslim, and very similar numbers, actually a little bit higher numbers, just slightly for Mormons. And what do these two groups have in common? Basically, geographic concentration, right? So Mormons in the Mountain West, Utah, Nevada, and Muslims more heavily in big population centers, Detroit, New York, other places. Outside of there, a lot of Americans just don't have a lot of contact. So limited knowledge, limited social interaction. And so where does that leave people with sort of general impressions? And the answer is it leaves them fairly cool with their attitudes towards Muslims. This is a feeling thermometer scale that we ask people to rate on a scale of 1 to 100 their feelings of warmth or coldness toward various groups. So 100 is very, very warm, 1 is very, very cold, 50 is very tepid, and you'll see, so down here, this is sort of interesting from a contextual point of view, right? So we rewind the clock to the 1920s. If you were to say Catholics and Jews were among the groups that Americans had the warmest feelings about, that would be kind of a surprise, right? I mean, in the 1920s, we had Yale and Harvard having quotas for the number of Jews that they were letting in to the universities, and Jews and Catholics as well. And today, though, I mean, one other sort of just anecdotal thing. I mean, to sort of show how integrated Catholics and Jews have become. Most of you probably know, but I think a lot of the public doesn't know. I haven't asked this, probably should ask this on a survey just to see who knows, but there's currently no Protestant on the U.S. Supreme Court bench right now, right? There's only Catholics and Jews on the U.S. Supreme Court bench. And this is sort of really interesting at the very elite levels of, the judicial branch. Very sort of strong evidence of integration. Muslims, on the other hand, only atheists in America have lower feeling thermometer ratings than Muslims do in the country. Not by much, but by just a bit here. So that's sort of like where people's dial is set, basically, in terms of just general warmth, based on limited knowledge and limited contact. So we tried to get underneath this a little bit. I'm going to slow down a little bit here because it's a little bit complicated. But we asked a battery of questions, and we listed several attributes, and we asked people whether these attributes described American Muslims well or not well. right? And so what I've done is I framed all of these in the negative, just so that the numbers will all run in the same direction. And I put them in descending order. So when we asked about this attribute there, respectable of the rights of women, describe American Muslims well or not well, 69% said not well. This was the highest score. They embrace arranged marriages, well or not well. Well, 59% said well. Respect religious freedom and beliefs of others. 54% said that does not describe American Muslims well. Hold extreme political views. 53% said well. Loyal to America. 52% said that does not describe American Muslims well. So, a fairly negative portrait of various attributes here. The interesting one, the one that really jumps out to me is, this one. It's nearly 7 in 10 said that this attribute of respecting the rights of women does not describe American Muslims well. And what's, I think, really interesting about this is that a high number of Americans think this, and it affects how warm they feel about American Muslims. So this is the feeling thermometer scores from that previous slide. So the mean is 45. That's where the general public is. So you can see among that 7 in 10 who say that being respectful of the rights of women does not represent or does not describe American Muslims well, the feeling thermometer drops to 39 among that group. So it has a kind of stronger correlation with overall images of the Muslim community. Whereas this one, even though nearly 6 in 10 say that embracing arranged marriages does describe the American Muslim community well, it has almost no effect on their sort of general warmth. That's right at the mean, pretty much. So this is sort of just like one little window into sort of part of what's going on, that sort of gender roles and women's rights is at least one part of the picture of sort of negative perceptions of American Muslims. We also asked a number of other attributes about just comfort levels with public expressions of Islam or the Muslim religion here. And as you can see, there's basically mixed. We asked people whether this would make them generally comfortable or uncomfortable. So Muslim women wearing the burqa, and in the survey we sort of described this longer about covering from head to toe that only shows the eyes, because most people wouldn't know the term. A mosque being built near your home, group of Muslim men praying in an airport. All of these are fairly sort of evenly divided, with slim majority saying they're comfortable, but significant minority saying uncomfortable. And then a Muslim teaching elementary school was the one that sort of has the strongest group of Americans saying that seems fine or seems comfortable. To me, it was 6 in 10 saying they're comfortable. But you could sort of see, so here's another gender issue over here with the burqa, and just some public expressions where there's just a really mixed level of comfort among the American public. Another sort of question there's a fairly long history on is whether or not Americans perceived Islam to encourage violence more than other religions. 38% of Americans say they agree with that statement. The same number says they neither agree nor disagree, and 22% say they disagree with that statement. So slightly more saying they agree than disagree, but a big bulk of people in the middle kind of neutral on the question. This number has stayed the same. There's a decade of trend data on this number. It's been about 4 in 10, starting in 2002 when the first time this question was asked, all the way through 2012. All right, so this number has moved a little bit, but it's basically been about 4 in 10 Americans. So less than a majority, but a sizable minority that have this kind of concern about Islam being linked to violence. One other, I think, way of kind of seeing what I've kind of called here the American double standard on religious violence. We asked this question in the wake of the mass shooting in Scandinavia, right? That was carried about by a white Christian who wrote a kind of Christian manifesto justifying his actions. And so we had a kind of example that was in people's minds of someone who was Christian and claiming to be acting out of Christian conviction, committing violence. And so we asked, when people claim to be Christian and commit acts of violence in the name of Christianity, do you believe they really are Christian or not? All right, and what we found, and the way we did this in the survey is we actually split the sample in half. We asked half the sample the question about Christianity, the other half of the sample the question about Islam. And what we basically found is that 83% of Americans say no, that they do not believe that when a person claims to be Christian and commits acts of violence in the name of Christianity, they do not believe they're really Christians. So they sort of write them out of Christianity. And when you ask the question about Islam, and it says when people claim to be Muslim commit acts of violence in the name of Islam, you'll see the country's actually just divided on this. As many say, yes, I really believe they are really are Muslim, and just slightly more say, no, I don't believe it. But you can sort of see the real difference here in the way that people evaluate Christians who commit violent acts versus Muslims who commit violent acts. They're much more likely to pin it on their religion when it comes to Islam than they are dependent on their religion when it comes to Christianity. The other sort of thing that I think is very clear in the American context, and we've actually analyzed this quite sort of carefully, is that partisanship and television media consumption patterns play a pretty strong role in shaping Americans' attitudes on Islam and Muslims in America. So just some 3 benchmark questions down here at the bottom. American Muslims want to establish Sharia law in the country. Muslims are not an important part of the religious community in the U.S., and the values of Islam are at odds with American values. And here, these are partisan breakouts. So you can see the Democrats, self-identified Democrats, are in blue here. Independents are sort of in orange. Republicans are in red, and self-identified members of the Tea Party are this darker amber color here. And you can see that the Tea Party, especially on this question about Sharia law, this is a significant difference between self-identified members of the Tea Party and Republicans overall. But you can really see a kind of linear relationship between party ID and these attitudes on these various benchmarks. The pattern looks basically the same across these. And I could actually add 3 or 4 or 5 other examples, and the patterns all look basically the same, right? So Democrats least likely to have negative opinions, Independents somewhere in the middle, and Republicans more likely to have negative opinions about either Islam or American Muslims, depending on how you ask, or depending on which question you ask. The levels are higher or lower, but the patterns are basically the same. Now we'll see a very similar effect if you look at media consumption patterns. So this question across the different media outlets are generated by a question that asked Americans, which do you trust, or which television news network do you most trust to give you accurate information about current events and politics, right? And they listed all these different media outlets. About 23% of Americans, or 23% of Americans said they most trust Fox News to give them accurate information about current events and politics. And the one that really jumps out here is Fox News, right? So you can see this is the ones in red. The other ones really, they vary a little bit, but the differences are not large. But among Americans who say they most trust Fox News to give them accurate information about current events and politics, their views are quite different than people who most trust basically any other news outlet in the country. And one thing to sort of bring this home, I think, is if you look just among Republicans and on this one question about whether the values of Islam are at odds with American values in public life, you can see the difference it makes even among Republicans, right? So if you only look at Republicans, so here's all Republicans, 63%, 2-to-1 agree with this statement, basically. But if you break them out and look at just those who most trust Fox News versus Republicans who trust any other, or sort of all other media outlets, you'll see this really stark difference that, this is now almost 3-to-1. Those who watch Republicans who watch Fox News agree with this statement, while Republicans who say they most trust any other source of media really are fairly divided, and in fact don't look that much different than the general public, right? So if you take this bar, compare it to the general public over there, these are not that significantly different. So you can really see, even among sort of within the kind of Republican constituency, media consumption patterns are really making a strong difference, even among that group. So let me kind of broaden the sort of as a way of wrapping up, and then we'll go to questions, kind of broaden the scope a little bit, and sort of put some of this in the context of where Americans are on immigration and newcomers as well. One of the things that we've heard very early on in some focus groups that we were conducting is that by and large, particularly white Americans, see or think about Muslims through the lens of immigrants, right? So never mind that, Muslims have been here for hundreds of years, and there's an African-American Muslim community here that has a very, very long history. But by and large, what we heard over and over in the focus groups is sort of first thing that comes to mind is Arab immigrant, right? This is sort of the way that Americans tend to perceive it. But sort of in a general question about immigrants, Americans overall do think that the growing number of newcomers in the country strengthens American society, so still have a kind of optimistic belief, but not overwhelmingly, just a slim majority, 53%, while 42% say that the growing number of newcomers are really worried, right? That the growing number of newcomers actually threatens traditional American values. So really do see a kind of threat in growing numbers of recent immigrants. And this is part of the context that this conversation is happening in. One other thing that we noticed in the data is a fairly interesting one, is that if you ask about whether immigrants are changing local communities versus whether immigrants are changing the nation, you get different answers based on whether you're liberal or conservative. Right? So what's interesting about this is that if you ask just about changing the community a lot, there's not any real difference between liberals, moderates, and conservatives. So you compare these three blue bars here, right? 37, 38, 38, right? So, about 4 in 10, a little less than 4 in 10 of liberals, moderates, or conservatives say that immigrants are changing their local communities a lot. But if you ask about the country as a whole, changing American society a lot, you get ideologically different answers. So if you compare the light blue bars, liberals are much less likely to say that immigrants are changing the country than conservatives are. So despite the fact that at a local level, people are having basically the same experience, the perceptions of what that means for the country is quite different based on ideology. So that's a kind of interesting kind of underlying, I think, dynamic going on in the country. One other, so I'm going to sort of turn the corner here to sort of show some places where I think there may be, given a lot of, I think, news that looks pretty tough for kind of integration of Muslims into society and the kind of acceptance. But one place that Americans do see that Muslims are a group facing a lot of discrimination, right? So 6 in 10 Americans say, yeah, Muslims are a group that faces a lot of discrimination. Generally speaking, Americans don't like to discriminate. So again, sort of pushing back on a principle that Americans tend to hold fairly strongly. And then you can also see this in a number that we asked a question about what people thought about how widely Americans embraced a stereotype that like all Muslims are terrorists. And we found that really fairly strong number, 58% of Americans said, yeah, too many Americans think that, right? That's something that way too many Americans think. About 28% say they neither agree or disagree, but only 11%, 1 in 10, say they disagree with this statement. So there is a sense that I think what you can read into these numbers is that Americans, may not be locked down and have a sense that some of these stereotypes may have more life than they deserve, and some openings for sort of rethinking some of this. Also, this question I think is a sort of interesting one. It's an agree-disagree statement. American Muslims are an important part of the religious community in the U.S. 54%, a sort of majority, agree with this statement. 43% disagree with this statement. But I think what's most telling is if you look at this by age. So what happens is if you look at, there's a linear relationship between age and this question. So older Americans, those over the age of 65, only 44% agree that American Muslims are an important part of the religious community in the U.S. But if you look at 18 to 29-year-olds, 62% agree with this statement, right? So that there is this, very clear generational, I think, dynamic going on here. And we also see this, I could break out very similar charts like this on a number of other questions. And generally speaking, what you see is older Americans tend to have many more reservations or more cooler feelings toward Muslims, and younger Americans tend to have warmer feelings. There's a whole range of reasons for that, not least of which the younger generation is much more diverse in itself and already have more pluralistic relationships in their own social circles. They tend to be more educated than older Americans, so they're more educated, less white, than older Americans, and I think are more kind of prepared for a more diverse and pluralistic society. So I guess, sort of wrapping this up before we kind of go to questions and answers, that I think that the dynamic that is sort of the deeper dynamic that I see in the data really is something like Americans still wrestling with the place of American Muslims in American society, with principles that sort of lead the American public toward more acceptance, stereotypes working in many cases against that, and fears. But there is this sort of dance going on and this sort of wrestling between principles on the one hand, practice on the other, and kind of things like fairness on the one hand and fears on the other. And so this kind of interaction between these two things. And I think going back to the fact that many Americans, we're acting in a low knowledge, low social contact arena, and all of this is mediated mostly through media, right, and mostly through television. And so that, I think, is maybe both a blessing and a curse. That it probably means that these opinions are not solidly held because they're based on really low information. But it does mean that it really matters what happens in the media space, right? Because that's one of the main sources of information that's happening. So I think I'll close there and take some questions.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.